Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Chris Doherty, Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the Faculty here at Chestnut Hill College, and it's my delight to introduce Sister Kathy Duffy. I had a chance to see similar presentation when the Institute for Science and Religion hosted Sister Kathy, and you're in for a treat. Kathleen Duffy, SSJ, is Professor of Physics at Chestnut Hill College, where she directs the Interdisciplinary Honors Program and the Institute for Religion and Science. She is editor of Teilhard Studies and serves on the advisory boards of the American Teilhard Association and Cosmos and Creation. Her present research deals with the way Teilhard de Chardin's religious writings connect with modern science. She has published several book chapters and articles on these topics, an edited volume of essays entitled Rediscovering Teilhard's Fire, and two books, Teilhard's Mysticism, Seeing the Interface of Evolution, and Teilhard's Struggle, Embracing the Work of Evolution, forthcoming and in press with Orbis Books, and she'll be sharing information about this recent work with us today. Please join me in welcoming Sister Kathleen Duffy.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you all for coming. I really appreciate it. It's good to see you. So Pierre Teilhard de Chardin was born in 1881 in central France, near the city of Clermont-Ferrand, which is not too far from Le Puy, where our sisters were founded. As a child, he was interested in geology, and in 1899, soon after finishing high school, he entered the Jesuit order. During his formation period, he continued to gather fossils and specimens of rock and to map out the geological landscape wherever he found himself. While studying theology, he became interested in evolution, and aware that the church's position on evolution was quite negative. So because of that, he resolved to develop a way to help people see evolution and incarnation as related. After his formation period, he began the formal study of geology and paleontology, but his studies were interrupted when he was conscripted into the French army and served until 1919 as a stretcher bearer during World War I. Ironically, during the lulls between battles, he found time to work out his synthesis of evolution and incarnation. And in the years that followed, he continued to write and to strive to make clear this connection. Unfortunately, the church refused to allow him to publish his brilliant attempt at synthesis and even to teach. But today I would like to explore with you a particularly painful and confusing example of struggle from Teilhard's life. We begin in 1922 with Teilhard as a young and successful, finally professed Jesuit priest and university professor at the Institut Catholique in Paris. At that moment, it seemed that life couldn't be better. Teilhard had completed his Jesuit formation. He had developed an intimate spiritual relationship with his cousin Marguerite and felt much support from her kindred spirit. He had spent 4 years as a stretcher bearer in the French army during World War I and received honors for his exemplary service. The war was a time of great inner growth for him. Serving alongside men from all parts of the French Empire helped him to broaden his world. During the war, he composed the first of his religious essays, an exercise that helped him to clarify some of the details of his synthesis. He now hoped to share his views with others, especially with those who found the theory of evolution interfered with their belief in Christ, and with those who found the Christian teachings about creation outdated and somewhat childish. After the war, Teilhard completed his studies in geology and paleontology with the great paleontologist Marceline Boule, passed his dissertation with high honors, and received many awards. His popularity as a professor and lecturer was soaring, especially among the young, both students and seminarians, who were really enchanted with his fresh ideas. French ideas, too. He now had a mission to share his vision regarding the role of Christ in the evolutionary cosmos. His energy was vibrant enough to electrify all of Paris, and Paris was ready for him. Teilhard's life seemed to hold such promise. He did have some inkling, though, that things could go amiss. The atmosphere in Rome at the time was becoming quite ominous, especially for those who, like Teilhard and some of his friends, who were trying to update Catholic teaching. But unlike Teilhard and his friends, the church was not interested in any sort of updating. Instead, she was set on defending herself against modernism. And clearly, Teilhard's evolutionary ideas smelled of modernism. In response to the Vatican's concerns, the Jesuit order installed its own board of censors, to which all Jesuits wishing to publish had to submit their manuscripts. Working in the field of science, Teilhard might have considered his position safer than that of his young Jesuit friends in theology, who were having difficulty with the censors regarding their ideas. So to escape from the fire, because he was suddenly experiencing this criticism, he decided to respond to an open invitation he had received from Émile Lisson, a Jesuit paleontologist who had established a museum in China. Teilhard agreed to spend a couple months with Lisson to join his fossil-finding expeditions and to help him analyze some of the specimens in his growing collection. After a year and a half, he was finally permitted by his superiors to return to Paris. But he was extremely happy to be back to continue his work at the Institut Catholique. Soon after his return in 1924, the sword fell. He was summoned to Lyon by his provincial, Père Costa de Beauregard, about a paper he had written 2 years earlier. It seems that in 1922, after a spirited lecture in Belgium, a lively discussion ensued, with Teilhard speculating freely about new ways to understand original sin in the light of evolutionary theory. Two of the theologians requested that he write a follow-up note. He did this, made 7 copies of the note, sent a few copies to friends whom he felt he could trust to keep it confidential, and kept 1 paper in his desk drawer. In his short essay called Note on Some Possible Historical Representations of Original Sin, Teilhard discusses the problems and 3 possible solutions to a literal interpretation of the story about Adam and Eve, original sin, and the Garden of Eden, found in Genesis. Actually, he didn't particularly endorse any of these solutions. However, in some mysterious way, a copy of the note reached the Jesuit Curia, and the Jesuit Regional Assistant Superior for France asked Costa to speak to Teilhard and tell him to submit a written promise to avoid dealing with these issues in the future. When Teilhard received the letter, he was distraught. His distress was almost unbearable. He wrote immediately to his friend Auguste Valençon in desperation, asking him to meet with him before his meeting with Costa. My dear friend, help me. They want me to promise in writing that I will never say anything or write anything against the traditional position of the church on original sin. This was a statement that seemed too vague and too absolute. At their meeting, Père Costa relayed the final decision of the Jesuit general, Vladimir Ledachowski. Teilhard was to promise in writing to stop speaking and writing both in public and in private about anything contrary to the church's traditional dogmatic teaching on original sin, as traditionally interpreted. Otherwise, he would be dismissed from the order. He tried to bargain. He felt that he could, in conscience, reserve for himself the right to carry on research with professionals and the right to bring help to the disturbed and the troubled, especially those who found it difficult to believe. He suggested an alternative statement, one that he could sign in good conscience. He said, "I bind myself not to spread the particular explanation contained in my note," because obviously he didn't think it was worthy of publishing anyway. Though still reluctant, he was willing, at least for a time, to give up publishing his ideas, but never willing to stop exploring them. Teilhard wrote to the Jesuit curia to clarify his position and to reassure them that he would be in compliance. Also, his provincial, Père Costa, did try to intervene with Ledachowski. Others, including the rector at the Institut Catholique, who was concerned about losing a professor as fine as Teilhard, also requested that Ledachowski change his mind and be less harsh. But by this time, the general was not willing to back down. Incensed at the content of Teilhard's note and aware of the repercussions that it could have for the Jesuit order, Ledachowski decided to put an end to Teilhard's influence. Teilhard finally realized that he had two options: to sign a series of 6 propositions, 5 of which were taken directly from documents issued at the Council of Trent and the First Vatican Council, and another, a statement about Adam and Eve as our first, our sole first parents, or the other option was to be expelled from the order. This was an impossible decision for him, a total shock. He wasn't ready to give up being a priest or a Jesuit. Those were serious and sacred commitments. And he wasn't ready to give up his spiritual independence, a quality so deeply inculcated into the Jesuit persona and so highly valued by him. He felt alone, unable to determine the next step. 2 choices: obedience or freedom of conscience. He wrote to Valençon, "I've been keeping up appearances, but inside me, there's something like an agony, a real storm." Teilhard found himself in a situation that was doing violence to all that he felt called to and all that he hoped for, a situation that he knew he was not able to change, no matter what he did. So after much anguish, prayer, discussion with his friends, and consultation with his provincial, he chose the first option. And although he signed the propositions, he was interiorly clear about maintaining his spiritual freedom while keeping to the letter of the law. The ramifications were severe. He was no longer welcome in Paris, where he felt he could be most effective. He returned to China and soon after was required to relinquish his position at the Institut Catholique. While surrendering the opportunity to teach and publish his revolutionary ideas, he could never abandon his personal search and resolved instead to dedicate himself to deepening his synthesis. He knew that he could never abandon his call to reform the church from the inside. He said that if I were to desert the place that life has assigned to me, I would betray the world However, this new development was making it almost impossible for him to reach his goal. Teilhard's personal growth seemed to be severely stunted. He was blocked from receiving the kind of worldwide feedback that publication provides, feedback that would have honed the ideas that he hoped would blossom into a much broader synthesis. And his struggle with the church and the order continued, as did the trauma, especially as he strove during the 1940s to have his major opus, The Human Phenomenon, approved by the Roman censors for publication. But he refused to be daunted. Over the years, he actually worked harder than ever to make his ideas clear. Because he was not always silent, especially when he was asked questions, and because he continued to circulate his essays among interested friends, new restrictions became possible, were imposed on him. All of this had a terrible effect on his body. Chronic anxiety, weakness due to unhealthy living conditions during his final years in Peking, and a major heart attack, most likely due in part to the stress that resulted from his attempts to publish The Human Phenomenon. Teilhard struggled with this issue throughout his life. It was never really resolved. Even during his last days, he was not welcome in Paris. And since at the time he was unable to return to China because of the political situation there, he spent his last days at the Wenner-Gren Foundation in New York City, still writing and still believing that one day his message would survive his death. Before he left Paris, he willed his papers to Jean Mortier, who published them posthumously. Fortunately, we do have his work in the best shape that he could manage to leave it to us. At first glance, it might seem that Teilhard was foolish to continue to expect the church to change her opinion of his work. For years, his friends encouraged him to leave the church. They failed to understand Teilhard's devotion to an order that seemed not to recognize his value and that opposed the circulation of his thought. But for Teilhard, leaving the order and/or the church was short-sighted. He believed his call was to reform the church from within. Leaving would send a message in direct conflict with his conviction that what the world needed most in order to face the growing problems of the day was a renewed church, not an abandoned one. However, little by little, it was clear that many of the Jesuits, including the next general, Jean-Baptiste Janssens, were becoming more sympathetic to his cause. Eventually, he could see that his order was trying to protect him and themselves from even more severe restrictions by the church, and that his censors were not really able to understand what he was talking about. Still, the restrictions remained, and suspicion would surface whenever his name came into prominence. And only after his death was his dream of publication realized, but then it was too late for feedback, revision, and further development, at least by him. I would like now to consider Teilhard's response to this experience, both while he was struggling with Leduchowski's decision and also throughout his life. Here I rely on Constance Fitzgerald's analysis of impasse and Joan Chittister's anatomy of struggle. And to be clear, let me specify that what I mean by struggle is something more than a difficulty. Rather, it's a response to an experience that triggers great anguish, that touches the depth of the soul, and that causes shock to one's being. Because shock attacks the ego, often the first impulse is to fight against the event using logic and other means. However, these usually have no effect, especially in such serious and complicated situations. This kind of resistance tends to reinforce the ego, encourages violence, and further alienates the parties involved. A second option is to stay open while searching for the underlying reasons for the situation's occurrence, to examine the flow of events for errors in judgment, to let go of anything that would reinforce the ego, and to allow the new self to emerge. Shock is actually a call to higher consciousness, an effective means of self-transformation, but only if dealt with in this second way, a way that is assuredly much more challenging. Teilhard's interaction with his Jesuit general is a clear example of this kind of struggle. It involves an issue that meant everything to Teilhard. Ledychovsky's decision left Teilhard shocked, almost paralyzed, not knowing what to do next. Usual ways of resisting were not working for him. But instead of allowing himself to be completely defeated, he dealt with his anguish in the following ways. His first response was to allow the anguish to touch his soul. Instead of distracting himself from the reality, he brought his suffering to prayer and cried out to God for help. He must have felt some consolation, but grief work, as we all know, takes time. He also cried out to his friend Auguste Valençon, who was particularly supportive. Their discussions of the problem on the morning before Teilhard's first meeting with his provincial made it easier for Teilhard to grasp the situation as it really was, rather than to rely on false hopes of quick resolution. Teilhard was also used all available spiritual means of dealing with the issue. He engaged in prayer, counseling, a week-long discernment retreat. He wanted to understand the extent of his responsibility to comply with these restrictions. Ever convinced of the rightness of what he was trying to accomplish, he remained open to learning what was really happening and why. He also found concrete ways of resisting. He composed an alternative statement that he knew he could live with. Although this statement was never accepted, composing it helped him to understand ever more clearly the depth of his commitment to this work and to resolve ever more tenaciously never to abandon it. Finally, exhausted by his attempts to find creative solutions to the dilemma, he could see no way out. He recognized that a roadblock of this magnitude is a signal to surrender. A few years later, reflecting on his experience, he gives the following advice to those who must finally surrender. He says, as long as resistance is possible, resist. Should you meet with defeat, still inwardly resist. Though you're stifled and constrained, your efforts will be sustained. Eventually, Teilhard did surrender and did sign the 6 propositions. The 4th proposition was at first very troublesome to him because, taken at face value, it involved a scientific statement about evolution, not a religious statement, and therefore not in the purview of the church. Perhaps Teilhard realized this so that when he signed all 6, he was clear that he was not relinquishing his freedom to believe in the science of the day, and that he was still able to continue the work that he needed to do. And he never gave up. He resisted as far as possible, and sometimes even a little more than he should have, until the day he died. He continued to write. We now have 13 volumes of his religious essays. And he found an effective loophole, having his essays duplicated and distributed to friends and to all those who were interested in what he had to say, sometimes 200 copies at a time. Since these papers, photocopies, in the old days, were not official publications, this action was not in violation of his promise. His strength of character and deep spiritual life allowed him to resist the temptation to malign his oppressors. He was neither arrogant nor resentful and did understand that the pressure the church was placing on the Jesuit generals was severely complicating the issue. Having surrendered, he was free to develop his thought and to look for more creative ways of carrying out his mission. He kept optimistic about the future of the church, even when there seemed to be no hope. He believed that one day he would be able to publish. He continued to revise his essays, especially his manuscript for the Human Phenomenon, and to send them to Rome in hopes that they would pass the censors and be published. He spoke honestly to his provincials and his generals about his dilemma and about the importance of what he was doing, always with the hope that things would change. Might be right. He suffered deeply, not only mentally and spiritually, but also physically. And as he aged, his health began to fail. His depression worsened. And even though he never gave in to the feeling, he found it difficult at times to go on with life. But somehow, he was always able to return to the divine milieu, that place of inner comfort where he could sense the rightness of his mission and feel the consolation of the cosmic Christ. Teilhard's commitment to this decision to remain within the church was not an act of cowardice or apathy. Rather, it was totally consistent with his mission of union. As he says, to become a vital part of any organization, one must love its mission, live its mission to the full, and participate in its future. Clearly, Teilhard loved and lived the church's mission to the full. But he found his desire to participate in its future thwarted. However, he also understood that a Christian must be ready to suffer for the church, and sometimes even by the church, and to abandon the institution, especially at a time when his work for change seemed urgent, felt contradictory. Instead, he sacrificed his individual preference and continued to see this work as vital to the church, even though his power to effect change within the organization seemed minimal at the time. His decision was also consistent with his evolutionary worldview, as well as with his trust in the goodness of humanity. He believed that eventually things would change, that excesses would be minimized, that people would see the light, and that good would triumph. But he also knew that evolution is a slow process, and that struggle is an essential part of that process, a process that often resembles the royal road of the cross. So he continued refining the sap he was extracting from the great tree that is the church, and challenging all those who were impeding its growth. And new shoots have eventually emerged, though not until after his death. His writings did have an effect on the Second Vatican Council. The next Jesuit general, Pedro Arrupe, encouraged much more Jesuit involvement in the world, especially in peace and justice issues. The Vatican has been sponsoring workshops on faith and science with top scientists and theologians. And now we have a Jesuit pope, who is also a chemist, who is also trying his best to make changes in the church for the life of the world. Slow movements toward ever greater consciousness. Eventually, Teilhard began to see the importance of a synthesis for social, political, and religious organizations, and applied what he had learned from his personal struggles to the world scene. At the outset of World War II, he dealt with another kind of shock. Distressed again about the horrors of war, he was nevertheless hopeful that deeper awareness of the world's situation and greater enthusiasm for building a better world might result. He writes, "This tremendous war which so afflicts us, this universal longing for a new order, what are they but the shock, the tremor, and the crisis beyond which we may glimpse a more synthetic organization of the human world?" He knew from his experience with his order that times of instability and unrest, such as these, often spark greater consciousness, that shocking experiences can encourage new ways of doing things, heighten responsibility for the other and for the future, and greater participation in the soul of the world. The challenge would be, if and when peace would come, how to sustain interest in such a difficult and long-range project. Teilhard tried to analyze the situation and imagine a response that would be creative and effective. He wondered what steps and attitudes would be needed for humanity not only to survive as a species, but also to flourish, and eventually to bring about greater union and coherence to our world. Regarding world affairs, two questions seem vital: whether or not there's hope for survival of the human species in spite of the global chaos of his day, and two, if in fact there is hope, how to determine the best line of action to ensure humanity's flourishing. To answer these questions, he relied, as usual, on his understanding of the dynamic, creative processes that are operating in the cosmos as a whole, the principle of creative union, and the law of complexity consciousness. From the beginning of time, whenever two entities unite, ceding their individuality but not their identity, they have become something new, something more, something surprising. This pattern he calls creative union. Some examples: nuclei and electrons form atoms. Atoms combine to form molecules. Molecules unite to form cells, and cells form organisms. Each union produces an entity that's more complex, more surprising, and capable of more than the individual. Creative union has implications on the social level as well. When two people marry, when a group forms an organization or shares a research project, the result is an entity capable of accomplishing much more than the individual alone. Throughout the history of the universe, matter has been complexifying and producing ever more novel forms. This pattern led Teilhard to believe that the universe is convergent, that union is its fundamental goal. He also believed that matter is not purely physical. Rather, all matter, from the most elementary particles to plants and animals and finally to humans, is imbued with subjectivity, interiority, agency. He had learned this from his experience with animal fossils. During his fieldwork, he had noticed a correlation between brain size and consciousness, between physical complexity and spiritual capacity. His law of complexity consciousness tells us that as matter complexifies, it becomes capable of greater consciousness. And as matter becomes more conscious, it encourages greater complexity. Another creative process that has implications for social organizations as well. I find that Teilhard's analysis parallels in many ways the relatively new science of complexity theory. Like Teilhard's theory of creative union, Complexity theory is concerned with the emergence of novelty and the way structures form. It turns out that a collection of relatively simple entities can, without the benefit of a central controller, organize itself in a collective whole that creates patterns, uses information, evolves, and learns. When driven far from equilibrium, a chaotic system, such as a society during global turmoil, interacts with its environment in complex and nonlinear ways. And as it does, it develops the potential to change and to produce something new. Often a few simple rules suffice to explain the emergence of the new pattern. And if and when a critical point is reached, and so long as turbulence is avoided, the resulting pattern is held together in what is called a strange attractor. However, transitions to novel forms usually happen only in an atmosphere of instability and high energy, at what scientists call the edge of chaos, the critical boundary between order and turbulence, where for a complex system, communication is high and creativity optimum. Unstable and flexible enough to change, but not too turbulent, systems at the edge of chaos are creative. Complexity scientists have been studying the collective social behavior of insects, fish, and birds. One particularly stunning example is a phenomenon known as the murmuration of starlings. A flock of starlings flies as a single bird, contracting and expanding, soaring up and then diving down into the trees. This flock has no single leader. Instead, it is a decentralized system in which the flock's cohesive movement is created by interaction among the birds in the flock as a whole. To attempt to understand swarm intelligence, a group of researchers recently spent 3 years videotaping and analyzing the movements of very large flocks of starlings, 30,000, 50,000. Using sophisticated software, they determined the position of the individual bird and, with a computer model, simulated the movement of each individual to try to understand how the movement of a given bird is affected by its neighbors. They found 2 interesting results. The first is that each bird stays equally close to its 7 nearest neighbors. And since the distance between birds is now not fixed, the flock is free to expand and contract. So if I'm one of the birds and I move this way, away from, the distance, I'm going to have to, to adjust every part of myself, and everybody else in the whole flock is going to have to do the same thing. The second rule, here's the first rule. Each bird stays equally distant from its 7 nearest neighbors. The second rule is birds at the edge of the flock tend to bunch closer together, constricting the flock so it tends to fly as a whole in the same general direction, not all by itself. So swarm behavior is an effective strategy for survival. The need to escape from a predator drives the starlings to interact in a coherent, highly organized way, making the flock look like a large creature, a phenomenon that mesmerizes the predator. It's almost as if a strange attractor is keeping the birds centered. Because each individual bird accepts a goal larger than itself, the starling swarm behaves like a single organism. No single creature is in charge. Instead, each member acts on local information to produce complex collective behavior. Rather than being controlled by external influences, the swarm exhibits a dynamical order in which each bird cooperates to perform a coherent function. This dynamism is made possible because the predator drives the swarm far from equilibrium and helps each bird access its energy that's needed. This flock is a self-organized, dynamical system with emergent properties. And so what I'd like you to do is watch for a minute, for 3 minutes, it's almost 3 minutes long, this little video of a starling swarm that's I put to music. You would think the birds were hearing the music before they started their dance. Okay, hopefully this will work. But what is the force that will initiate among us and sustain within us a more coherent approach to the problems that beset our world? How can we become like the starlings and work together on problems that confront us? Teilhard attributes this unifying force needed for the transition to a more mature humanity to the person of the cosmic Christ, who, though never compelling, ever allures, attracts, and impels the cosmos forward. A divine attractor, Christ acts from the future, continually guiding the cosmos, personalizing it, amorizing it, bidding it to recognize its privileged position at the evolutionary front, and to take a transformative step toward greater consciousness. In a eulogy delivered at Teilhard's funeral service, the one that was celebrated in France 2 weeks after his death in New York City, his good friend and superior René Dwins spoke highly of his many outstanding qualities, but in the end he made special mention of Teilhard's participation in the church and in the world. Teilhard, he said, was one of the few Jesuits in his generation who shared so deeply and with such passion in the hopes and efforts and the boundless ambitions of his time. I suppose that such a deep commitment to the future of both church and world is not surprising, for a person who took his mission so seriously. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. I know that some of you might have to go, so please feel free to do that. But I don't mind answering a few questions if you would like to do that. Let me just turn the light back on so we can see each other. Or you could make a comment. You might have the answer to Creative Union. I hope you were able to make, I omitted things from the talk, but I'm hoping you see the connection between, you know, the world and some of the things we're talking about.
Did Teilhard have a big conflict? So he had a big conflict about the creation story and how evolution played into that. How did he study the creation story? Did he study it in French, or did he study it in like its native Hebrew and try and compare the differences in there for like maybe symbolism instead of literalism in the story?
Well, I don't think he really, well, he probably studied it he might have studied it in, you know, in Greek or Latin or something like that. I don't know. But it was just, he knew the creation story and knew that so many people were taking it literally. And he knew that couldn't be true because, for instance, it can't be two parents. I mean, in order to have evolution, you need two populations, not two people, you know. And so the whole idea, the ideas that came out, the Garden of Eden couldn't have been there, he said, because with evolution, you know, things keep developing. They couldn't have been this ideal place suddenly, and then it, you know, falls away. So there were just too many things in the story that didn't work literally. So, I mean, the story's great, but it has different meaning than the literal meaning, okay? So, yeah.
Was all his work recovered, or some of it got lost with all the problems he had?
Yeah, there were some things that were lost in China. You know, he didn't get all of it. He left China very quickly in 1946, because of the war and things like that. So he did lose some of the things. But I think the major things he had always been you know, sending to his friend Jean Mortier. And so most of the major things, I think, are, but not everything is published. There's still letters and things like that could, and I just wish I knew French. See, you know, better than I do. I know it a little bit, but nothing good enough to.
What was the significance of, why did he send off his work to Jean?
Oh, she was a friend, and she would, yes, but she would photocopy it for him, and it wasn't, they didn't have photocopy machines then, you know. They called it cyclostyle. But that was the way they, you know, they did it. So 200 copies should send out to all these different, you know, friends. So he did get some feedback, but he always wanted this to be a greater synthesis, not just what it was there. You know, he felt it needed to be worked on. So I really hope more and more people will get interested. Theologians, scientists, I mean, everybody needs to get part of it because he's so interdisciplinary. You know, and one of his problems was that he made up words to describe things. And that is difficult. You know, it's hard to interpret what somebody thinks if they make up a new word. And he didn't have enough time to explain it. If he had been in Paris, he probably would have done that better. On the other hand, when he was in China, he did all kinds of wonderful science. So, and he had time to write. So one never knows. You know, one does his or her best with what little life one has. Anybody else?
It's always been my impression that he was against the nationalism that led to World War II. And so his synthetic sense of a new emerging trans whatever group. But I mean, he would flip out if he saw what was going on in Europe today. I think, you know, that it is this retrenchment from, yeah. I did hear this, though. A couple years ago, Elaine Pagel, you know Elaine Pagel, she came to Penn, and she said original sin did not exist for the Hebrews. So this whole Genesis didn't exist for them. And really, it existed in the 4th century with Augustine. But wait a minute, it was an answer to a political problem. Original sin, political problem.
And Teilhard says it's a static solution to the problem of evil. So in other words, if we don't know about evolution, we can't explain evil. And so we make up a story. And it's good enough, I guess, for that. But once we know evolution, it just doesn't make any sense anymore. And so that was what he was trying to be sure. He knew so many people who really just couldn't stomach, the kind of doctrine they were given that didn't work. And he was trying to make it reasonable. And for himself, first of all, and then to share that with others.